Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for September 17th, 2024. Today I'm going to talk about something that a number of you have been writing about, asking what's going on with the so-called de-dollarization with the BRICS. Is this something we should be worried about? What does it all mean? And I'm going to give you a brief picture of the incredible transformation that's underway globally. That is a move to put an end forever to the era of imperial exploitation. Now, this goes back to the 15th century when you had the conquest of the Canary Islands by the Crown of Castile. You had the advances of Spanish and Portuguese imperialism into the New World, the Americas, into Africa. Eventually, in the 16th and 17th centuries and 18th centuries, the moves by the French, the British, and the Dutch into Africa and Asia. Now, what allowed the Europeans to do this was the advances that occurred as a result of the scientific development of the Golden Renaissance and then the Industrial Revolution, which, on top of everything else, gave them a kind of military power that was much advanced beyond what existed in the rest of the world. Now, the advances in Europe were underwritten by the plunder of the imperial system. That is, the story that they went to Africa and elsewhere to bring Christianity and wonderful ideas is a bunch of hokum. They went for loot. They went for grabbing whatever they could in terms of raw materials, as well as labor, including the slave trade. And this is the strength of the imperial system, which is the control of colonies around the world and became the basis for the British Empire in its use of sea power. Now, the decolonization in the 20th century was a long time coming, and there had been revolts and rebellions, but the problem was that the standard of living in the West was dependent on getting cheap raw materials from the South and East, and then increasingly from selling goods that were finished products from the West. Now, examples of this are the Cecil Rhodes operation in Africa. After World War II, this was consolidated in the International Monetary Fund system. And increasingly, the United States became the enforcer of the IMF system. And what the IMF did was, through control of banking, through control of currency, control of trade, they made nations dependent upon Western finance. And then, in order to pay back the debt, they used the conditions imposed by the West to loot the countries even further. And this became especially clear after World War II with the establishment of the International Monetary Fund. And this is very beautifully described in the book by Perkins, Economic Hitmen, that the Western powers would go in, grab what they wanted. If there was a rebellion against it or opposition to it, they could pull off coups, assassinations, and so on. Well, the full decolonization really began with the Bandung conference in April 1955. There were many developments before that. For example, the American Revolution was against colonialism. It was an anti-colonial movement. But in 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, Nehru and Sukarno brought together many of the countries of what today is the Global South, which eventually led to the creation of the non-aligned movement. That is, the idea that you didn't have to be part of the Soviet bloc or the Western bloc, but you could develop as parallel order. But of course, it still depended on credit and currency controls and so on, dictated by the Western powers largely through the City of London. Now, it was in 1975 that the first real challenge to this as a global system was launched when Lyndon LaRouche gave a press conference in Bonn, Germany, and presented his plan for an international development bank. outside of the IMF system, outside of the control of the Western banks, in which you would have agreements by nations, multilateral agreements, that would establish the basis for credit, not with the dollar, but with an ability to establish currencies based on real physical goods production. And this is LaRouche's idea of physical economy. Now, what he proposed at the time ran up immediately against the policy of Henry Kissinger, who was the U.S. Secretary of State then in 1975. Kissinger's policy was called National Security Study Memo 200, which was a Malthusian document which said the Western countries should use food as a weapon to reduce population and population growth of nations in the global South. The Kissinger NSM 200 was parallel to the geopolitical doctrine that was presented by Zbigniew Brzezinski as a way of creating a new empire under U.S. military power, which was then consolidated after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991-92. And we had at that point the unipolar order, which was the dollar order, the weaponization of the dollar against nations that wished to develop. Now, this is what's being overturned right now with the emergence of the BRICS. Initially, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, why those countries? Well, in particular, they have a tradition of sovereignty, but also economic development, especially China, as a new model for developing sector countries, and Russia. Now, the BRICS came together and immediately were threatened. The idea would be the BRICS should either be completely subordinate to the existing system or they shouldn't exist. Well, they're not going to do that. These are nations that prize their sovereignty. And as a result, the BRICS is emerging as an economic development coalition, which is outside the dollar system. It's not outside the dollar system yet and is not intending to break with the dollar completely. It would be impossible right now. But they're establishing other means of trade, for example, in national currencies, the ruble and the rupiah between Russia and India, the yuan trade for Chinese purchase of Saudi oil, and the shutting down of the petrodollar agreement from 1974 that Kissinger arranged with the Saudis is another step in that direction. Because what the petrodollar agreement did was mean that all oil sales would be denominated in dollars, which meant you would have to go through New York banks or London banks to get the dollars to buy the oil. And then when the Saudis or the other oil producers got the money, there was a kickback into those same banks. That was what Kissinger organized. That's done with. So what we're seeing now is a shift in global economic activity and production from the so-called rich northern countries, which are going through a deindustrialization, foolishly, and an emergence of sovereign nations in the global south, which are interested in the kind of economic development that nations in the northern hemisphere had to become the powers of the 20th century. Now, the BRICS will have their next conference in Kazan, Russia on October 22nd. It's unlikely they're going to have a new currency coming out of that. They're still working on it. The new development bank is taking baby steps toward creating funds for development. But the BRICS will continue to expand and continue to grow. Now, is de-dollarization a threat to you? Because I know a lot of people think this is somehow an attack on the dollar and an attack on America and an attack on the American people. It's actually something that could liberate the United States from the control of the same empire, which controls you, that has been controlling the nations of the global south. The potential is to break the power of the global corporate cartels in finance and real estate and insurance, companies like BlackRock, to break the control of big pharma and the other corporate giants. And by doing that, creating the potential for fair trade on a global basis and economic development. That's the goal of what LaRouche had in mind with the drafting of the International Development Bank, to take the power away from corporate cartels who are committed to depopulation and put it back in the hands of sovereign governments acting in the interests of their people. And so the de-dollarization, the moves of the BRICS is a big no to the World Economic Forum, to the Trilateral Commission, to the IMF. No more free trade for billionaires. Instead, sovereign nations working together in a multinodal order of fair trade and development. And that's why that threat to the cartels is why the US and NATO are going to war against Russia, are threatening to go to war against China, and anywhere else where they feel threatened. I'll have some links for you in the description section of LaRouche's ideas that shape this fight. But this transition is going to take place one way or the other. And the best thing for the United States and Europe would be to join the nations of the Global South and the BRICS in seeing that this is a peaceful transition away from a collapsing dollar empire. So do some reading. I'll be back on Thursday. Tomorrow, my younger colleague, Simon Miller, will have the update for you.